So physics is the science of how nature on the screen of perception behaves over time. Philosophy comes in informed by physics, trying to make educated guesses about what nature is in and of itself. If a physicist says the world is fundamentally physical in essence, he's making a philosophical pronouncement, not a scientific pronouncement. Even if he's not aware of this difference, that's what actually is going on. So I would say that given the latest results from physics regarding how nature behaves, the idea that physicality has standalone reality has been refuted. All the properties that we associate with physicality or materiality, such as mass, charge, spin, momentum, whatever, these are now proven experimentally in a way that has been repeated by multiple groups over 40 years with increasing sophistication. These physical properties are a result of measurement. They didn't exist prior to measurement, which shows that what we call the physical world is not the bottom layer of reality. It is not the foundation. It is the appearance of something else. And of course, appearances, you can only speak of appearances if something is observed, because then it appears. Prior to observation, there is no appearance. There is only the world as it is in itself. And that world we now know, short of one question, we now know it's not physical. It cannot be physical. And idealism comes in and says, well, it's mental, and physicality is just the appearance of mentality from certain points of view. Now, arguably, the only way to evade this conclusion is to postulate that there are gazillions of real physical universes popping into existence every infinitesimal fraction of a femtosecond, for which we have exactly zero evidence. So what's more plausible? And this is not a surprise to me. The conclusions I think we arrive at under an analytic idealist framework are very consistent with the essence behind most of the world's religions, what Aldous Huxley called the Perennial Philosophy. In other words, once you cut through all the metaphor, all the judging, all the specific details, and you get to the core of a religion, that core tends to be the same across multiple religions. I mean, it's well known that Christianity and Buddhism share a core to a surprising extent. That core, that perennial philosophy, is consistent with what I'm putting forward. And I don't think that is surprising because, something is true. We may not know what it is, but something is true, and we are bang in the middle of it. We are living in what is truth. What is true? Whether we understand it or not, we are bang in the middle of that. So we are bound to eventually, across cultures and across time, to stumble upon a realization of the truth. The truth is not fragile. Even if we are deluded about it for 300 years, the truth is still true, regardless of what we think of it. And we are still bang in the middle of it. So it's not a surprise to me that this consistency is there, but I certainly wouldn't use my approach to create a new religion. That's not what it's all about. No. Yeah, one of the foundations of physicalism is the naive notion that our perception is like a transparent window into the world, that the shapes and forms and contours that we discern when we look at the world are the forms of the world as it is in itself, or as it was before we looked at it. So this is a very naive and now proven wrong assumption. We cannot perceive the world as it truly is, because if we had the perceptual apparatus that would allow us to see the world through a kind of transparent window, we would have no upper bound in the dispersion of our inner perceptual states, because there is no upper bound to the dispersion of the states of the world. So if we were to mirror that dispersion, that diversion, that variety, that diversity, if we were to mirror the diversity of states of the world inside ourselves through perception, there would be no guarantee that we wouldn't melt into some kind of warm soup. because we couldn't then resist the second law of thermodynamics. So this is a sophisticated technical way to say the following. If perception were a transparent window, simply by looking at the world, we would run the risk of dying, because the dispersion of the world would be reflected in the dispersion of our inner states, and we wouldn't be able to maintain our structural integrity if all that dispersion were mirrored inside. So this is a mathematical argument that has been made in the last 8 years, I think. There is a similar argument from evolutionary theory that evolution would drive true perception swiftly to extinction. There is just too much information in the world, presumably, for us to apprehend all that through perception. We need a sort of interface, a simplifying interface. Professor Donald Hoffman compares that to the desktop metaphor of a computer. Yeah. A little file on the desktop is like a rectangle, a colored rectangle. But the file, as it really is a pattern of millions of open and closed microscopic silicon switches. If we were to see the file for what it really is, we wouldn't be able to work with a computer. So we get a sort of a representation thereof that allows us to use the computer. In the same way, nature or evolution would never have constructed sense organs that gave us a sort of a view of what is really out there. It would be too confusing. We would be driven to extinction. What we have is a sort of a virtual reality headset. So the idea behind all this is that what we call the physical world or materiality is not the thing in itself. It's an image thereof, a representation thereof. It's the way the world as it is in itself appears or presents itself to the screen of perception. But matter is not the ultimate reality by definition, because it's an appearance of something else that then, again, by definition, is non-material. Because if you call matter the representation, then the thing represented is by definition not material. It doesn't have any of the properties that we usually associate with matter or physicality. I don't think nature has been metacognitively designed with a specific purpose, because that would be required for us to talk about malfunction. Malfunction is when something happens that doesn't contribute to that specific purpose. I don't think nature was designed in this way. I think nature is spontaneous. It unfolds itself spontaneously based on what it is. I think the physical world is a appearance. It is the dashboard, or it is the virtual reality, whatever metaphor you prefer, so long as you keep in mind that it's a metaphor. Evolution by natural selection has constructed this virtual reality or this dashboard for the purposes of survival in the earthly planetary ecosystem, given the conditions and circumstances of that ecosystem. Now, those conditions and circumstances do not include travel at close to the speed of light. So that dashboard did not have to evolve to make sense of that particular space in the possible circumstances. Nobody runs around that close to the speed of light. Relativity effects did not take place in Paleolithic life before we developed technology. So the dashboard doesn't need to make sense under those circumstances. It didn't evolve to allow us to survive in those circumstances. Those circumstances were utterly irrelevant for our survival as an animal running around planet Earth. So it's not a malfunction of the dashboard. It's just that the dashboard was not made in such a way that we can make intuitive sense of relativity effects. Our cognitive apparatus didn't evolve for that. That was not the purpose of the dashboard. There are undeniable correlations between patterns of our brain activity and our inner experiences. That's undeniable. There is also an undeniable correlation between physical actions and inner experience. If you drink alcohol, your inner consciousness will sort of be altered. If somebody hits you in the head, something will happen with your conscious inner life. So these are undeniable things. It would be silly of anyone to say, oh, no, it's a coincidence or whatever. But a correlation doesn't imply causation. It's one of the most famous fallacies in philosophy and science. I think we mistake the image of the process for the cause of the process. I think brain activity is what my conscious inner life looks like from a certain perspective. It is the appearance of the process from a certain perspective. It's not its cause. And it correlates with my conscious inner life because the image of the process obviously correlates with the process. It's what the process looks like. So of course they will correlate. But I don't think this correlation implies a cause. I think if you want to talk about cause, I think you have to invert the arrow of causation. It is my conscious inner life that causes this image. And that causation is instantaneous. So it's very difficult to pin it down. When we get confused, mistaking image for cause, we also get confused mistaking description for the thing described, which is the basis of the materialist metaphysics, this materialist worldview, wherein we say that what really exists is mass, charge, momentum, spin, frequency, amplitude, geometrical relationships, all these quantities, all these physical descriptors in numbers. These are very handy and effective ways to describe perceptual experience. That's how these numbers came about. That's how the equations of physics came about. Physics is a science of perception. Even if you use instrumentation, equipment to enhance our perception, like telescopes and microscopes and scanners of every sort, you still need to perceive the output of these tools in order for them to have any effect, to have any meaning. So physics is a science of perception, and we've discovered that it's very handy to imagine that there is something out there underlying those perceptions. It's very handy to imagine that in order to predict how perception will behave, which is the basis for technology. But then we get lost and we think that what really exists is the description, all these numbers, all these equations, and that what they describe, in other words, perception with its felt qualities, that is secondary. That is somehow created by our brains inside our skull. There is no world out there of colors and flavors. No, all these colors and flavors, according to mainstream materialism, are created inside your head, inside your skull. What is really out there is best described as an abstract set of equations, perhaps some silhouettes and forms, but also abstract, defined in geometric terms. So that's the other big error. We start from the thing that really exists, we describe it, and then we mistake the description for the thing that really exists. And we mistake the image of the process for the cause of the process. I think these are the two main confusions of the Western mind for the past 300-400 years, since the 17th century. And at root, they are one only thing, manifesting itself in two different ways. I think at root, these two mistakes, replacing the reality described with the description and mistaking the image of a process for the cause of the process, I think at root, they are one and the same error, the same mistake, just manifesting itself in two different ways. Right. And we don't laugh about it because we are immersed in it. We are in the historical juncture in which these mistakes somehow have become plausible within our cultural narrative. But I have very little doubt that sometime from now, maybe not a long time from now, future generations will look back in tremendous surprise, almost with incredulity, and say, my God, how lost these people were. And they may laugh at us, but I think they will laugh in a heartfelt way, almost with sympathy. For what's going on today, because the narrative by which we live our lives today is outright ridiculous, but the consensus gentium makes this ridiculousness come across as plausible. if my postulate is correct, and I think we have plenty of reasons to believe it is, then it's all mind, right? But there obviously are boundaries, at least seeming boundaries within this mental context, because I can't read your thoughts. Presumably you can't read mine, at least under ordinary circumstances. I don't know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda. So if we are all in one big mind, we have to account for these barriers that prevent us from reaching out beyond our personal selves.
Right.
So, and I think what we can appeal to is to a well-known psychiatric phenomenon called dissociation. But that's more difficult to explain outside an academic context. So I use the metaphor of a whirlpool. You can imagine universal mind or universal consciousness as a body of water. And within that body of water, you have a sort of localization process of certain mental content, which lead to the appearance that there are individual minds. And a way to visualize that, not very rigorously, but it's very evocative, is to think of little whirlpools or eddies forming in water, because you can clearly identify them. You can say there is a whirlpool. You can trace the boundary of the whirlpool very precisely in the same way that we can trace the boundaries of our bodies. And we can say there is a body. And yet there is nothing to a whirlpool but the water of that body of water. And you cannot lift the whirlpool out of the water because it is water. There's nothing to it but the water. In the same way, I would say that there is nothing to us or to any living being other than mind. But we are just the images, the appearances of a process of localization within mind that you can visualize as a whirlpool. But we are just mental beings as the rest of the world as well. Not only this idea of individual separate identity is an illusion. We have to qualify what I mean by illusion. What I mean, it's not fundamental. It's a temporary configuration of consciousness that we identify with and get attached to. But I would go further and say that even the very notions of space and time presuppose that dissociative process, because space and time are categories of perception. And what is perception? Perception is a point of view from across a dissociative boundary. When you perceive the world out there, this out there means it's across your dissociative boundary, because what is within your dissociative boundary you identify with. Those are your thoughts, your emotions, experiences that rise within you. But what you perceive seem to be out there, seem to be separate from you. And I would say that those are also mental processes that present themselves as the physical world because you look at them from across a dissociative boundary. So from that perspective, it is separation that is illusory in the sense of being ephemeral. It's a narrative of self-identity that's not grounded in any fundamental aspect of existence. Ultimately, I am you and you are me and we are the whole thing going on. There is only one thing going on. And of course, that realization, if it's really internalized more than intellectually, it's life-changing. And it has tremendous bearing on our sense of ethics or our sense of morals. Because we are no longer this fundamentally separate thing that will die and then will not care about what will happen to the world 50 or 100 years from now and let the next generations deal with it because we are not going to be here. Well, guess what? From that perspective, what you truly are, you will always be here. And whatever is happening, you are doing this to yourself. So yes, it's a very different way to look at the world if you truly internalize it. Yeah, this needs to be more than intellectual. And my message is intellectual because I think we need our intellects to give ourselves permission to internalize something. Without that intellectual permission, it just bounces off. We have our intellectual barriers and ideas just bounce off as, oh, this is new age silliness. So,
Yes.
And then you don't give yourself an opportunity to really internalize it. So my job, the battle I fight, is a sort of ancillary. I think it's important, but it's not the core of the thing. The core of the thing is internalizing it. That's the only thing that will change the world.